All right, there we go. This law firm was still operating there and was in a sense dominated by these Dulles brothers, whose idea of international affairs and international business was shaped by the law firm's clientele, which is all the big business, or as I refer to it, the international syndicate. Um, One of Standard Oil's main goals, as shown by the proposals for oil exploration permits between World War I and World War II, was to gain access to the East Indies, especially the territory of the Netherlands, New Guinea, which is the area that we've been talking about, which eventually becomes part of Indonesia. Within a decade of Allen Dulles joining Sullivan and Cromwell, he had successfully secured the Dutch agreement for NNGPM, which gave Rockefeller Standard Oil 60% and U.S. Dutch Company, which was a joint venture with Britain, 40% ownership. So before World War I, Standard Oil of New Jersey had wanted a concession in Sumatra, but the Dutch would not let them in. And that's kind of what we've been talking about over the last little bit, kind of setting that standard that they're trying to get in. And we talked about them celebrating all of the Dutch holidays because they had been a Dutch colony for hundreds of years. Dulles Network included a person by the name of Allene, Allene, the last name is Tew. She also was called Countess Kotzebue. From 1936 to 38, she was still in Paris before her and her husband moved to the U.S. and bought a residence that used to belong to Vincent Astor, Astor, which of course everyone knows is one of the U.S.'s oldest families. And of course, it's in Newport, Rhode Island. For those of you who've never been to Newport, Rhode Island, we went not this summer, but last summer. We toured several of the mansions in Newport, Rhode Island. And all I can say is, oh my gosh. That's where Cornelius Vanderbilt has the breakers, and his wife's house, because she had a separate house around the corner, called the Marble Palace, or Pink Marble Palace, something like that. It was modeled off of Versailles in outside of Paris, where the king and Marie Antoinette lived. And as soon as you walked into the place, I'm looking around, I'm going, holy shit, this looks just like a miniature Versailles. And the lady standing at the door went, oh my God, that's exactly what she had. That's what inspired her to do this. And I said, well, she did a good job. Because when you walk in, it looks just like the hall when you walk in Versailles. And so it says here that the lot that their house sat on was 9 acres. And every inch of those yards is manicured to a T. The one called the Breakers that we went in, which was his house, had like 15 people full-time on staff just doing the junk that needed to be done. That's not like the chef and all that other stuff. It was crazy. They're just like monster big. But don't be envious, because the Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt decided who her daughter was going to marry. Until her daughter agreed to marry the guy that she had picked out, she locked her in her bedroom. Those people were crazy. So Allene Tew's wealth came mostly from her third husband, who had been a top executive at GE. Then the top level of the world's largest companies. Sullivan and Cromwell had been an integral part of General Electric since its inception 50 years before. Allene Tew's fourth marriage, which also ended in divorce, highlighted an aspect of Dutch politics that coincided with Dulles' interest. Her former husband, Prince Heinrich the 33rd, who was related to the German husband of Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, because you know they're all related, who at the time, well, for a very long time, was considered, her husband was considered the heir to the Dutch throne, because Queen Wilhelmina couldn't have a baby. She had kept having stillbirth and miscarriages until finally Juliana was born, and then she became the heir apparent. And of course, that Bernhard eventually, when they grow up, he marries her, and that's where we got into the WWF, because he basically starts all of these nonprofits to continue the Dutch colonialization under a different name. So, Prince Bernhard briefly went to England in 1935, the year after his father died, and began working for I.G. Farben. And the author goes through a whole bunch of how they met, and that Aline II's first son was killed as a pilot in World War I, and so she basically adopts Bernhard. And so she's actually one of their kids' godmother, Juliana and Bernhard. So she basically, and I mean, when she met Bernhard, he was older, but she basically adopted him. Her son was a pilot, he was a pilot. They had lots of other things in common. They looked very similar. She bought him a Mercedes Benz, like the couple $100,000 versions of it that used to belong to the King of Spain. Gifted him all of this different crap. So, Sullivan and Cromwell's representative of I.G. Farben operations in the U.S., Alan Dulles, was directly linked to I.G. Farben in Paris. Dulles' acquaintance with Prince Bernhard was through his links with I.G. Farben and through the Count and Aline II. The links between the two strengthened during World War II, and Aline II's former husband was first in line for the Dutch throne. And now she was the surrogate mother for Prince Bernhard. Juliana and Bernhard were first brought together by means of an arranged meeting that occurred at the Winter Olympics in 1936. Despite reports at the time that the person responsible for this matchmaking was the ambassador, Ambassador Loudon from the Dutch embassy in Paris, or the director of I.G. Farben, there's different stories. The bottom line is they met. They both knew Alan Dulles, and that started a long time of them working together, which really is important when you think about the aftermath of World War II, when they're setting up the WWF and they're setting up the UN and they're setting up NATO, and Alan Dulles is OSS during World War II. The fact that all of these people have roots going back so far changes the dynamic of them working together during World War II and the aftermath. It's not like they don't know each other. These roots go way back. So the emergence of Bernhard on the political stage at this point is seen under his role as the Viceroy of the Netherlands East Indies. This never came about, but it was seen as, because of course they end up having to get rid of it, but that was going to be his role. And that eventually is kind of their knowledge of that area and their relationship with Allen Dulles is how he got a lot of his intel in order to facilitate the regime change there. So, the significant development that occurred in 1935 in direct response to the Japanese was when Allen Dulles secured the Dutch agreement for the NNG-PM, which is that joint venture between Dutch Oil, Britain Oil, and Standard Oil. And we've already talked about that. Let's see. I'm just trying to hit the highlights here. There are two important American expeditions into the Netherlands, New Guinea. One happened in 1937, the other in 1938. The first one was called Denison Crockett, and Sidney Dillon Ripley was basically a zoologist, and during the early war years, he worked with Allen Dulles in the Rockefeller Center of the British Security Coordination. During the war, he was also in the OSS with Allen Dulles. His area of responsibility just so happens to be New Guinea, Indonesia. In 1938, the other expedition was led by Richard Archbold, who was the grandson of the former president of Standard Oil. So basically, this is Allen Dulles's area. The U.S. Navy provided the transportation for them to go around looking for geological, they're basically doing what the Dutch had already done, looking at all of the terrain, mapping it, and doing all that other crap. So, the ambassador to Berlin, William Dodd, noted in his diary that he had discussed a German lease over Netherlands, New Guinea with Hjalmar Slot, who was Hitler's chief of economics and the president of the Reichsbank. There were close links between Slot and Allen Dulles, as well as John Foster Dulles. And let's see. All right. Moving on. The pro-Nazi political settlement in the Indies was rapidly gaining popularity. They were looking to take control of the Indies government and was given a distinct boost by the marriage of Bernhard and Juliana. The people of Indonesia actually gave them a diamond as a marriage gift from the Indonesia area. 18 months earlier, the same governor general from Indonesia had been the leader of the Dutch National Socialists, the pro-Nazi party in the Netherlands. And basically what the author is doing is building kind of the bona fides, because we're going to talk about the Vichy viceroy, meaning that they had a lot of leanings towards fascism and at the time Nazism, but it really wasn't even Nazism. It was more of a fascist type authoritarian government. And between Sullivan and Cromwell, Allen Dulles, the Bernhardt, Juliana, their associations with I.G. Farben, you definitely get the feel that all of these people are, even if they're not in love with Hitler, they're in love with that style of government. Only months after the Netherlands transferred sovereignty of the Indies in December 1949, Indonesia changed its initial format and basically became they were originally set up as a federation, but they became a Unitarian state. And there was a lot of problems with the way they were set up, because basically you had some very large cities in like Sumatra that did most of the exporting. And the people that lived in Sumatra that worked really hard and was responsible for like 70% of the exports of Indonesia only got back from Jakarta, the capital, a fraction of what they were contributing to the economy. And when you have a large area, as Indonesia did, and you're a brand new country under your own control for the first time in like 300 years, there's going to be some growing pains. As those growing pains became apparent, fault lines, you might want to call them, because of Allen Dulles' large intel network, he began collecting the information of where those fault lines began to show, and is going to turn around and use those in order to overthrow Sukarno. And so the author goes back to the post 1963 Warren Commission, and there was a guy that did the questioning there by the last name of Jenner. And Jenner is the one that questioned George de Mohrenschildt. So George de Mohrenschildt and Prince Bernhard were about the same age. They both came from noble lineage in the European tradition. Obviously, they both knew Allen Dulles and have a very close relationship with him. George still considered himself in exile from Russia and liked to travel around in diplomatic kind of noble circles. George had an uncle by the name of Ferdinand. And in a New York Times article, they described, Ferdinand, who was the second secretary to the Russian embassy, as one of the weddings of the year. He had married somebody by the name of Miss Nona McAdoo. The president and Mrs. Wilson attended it, as did the Secretary of State, which was Lansing, who was Allen Dulles' uncle. So in 1938, Allen Dulles' contacts were already extensive, and George's personable nature and multiple skills were valuable, both in language, because remember, he speaks like 7 languages. So George was an ideal candidate for recruitment to be an intel operative. This predates any involvement of de Mohrenschildt with the CIA, which George admitted only years after Dulles' death that he actually was a CIA asset working for Allen Dulles. So keep that in mind as we go through this. George de Mohrenschildt lived for a while with his brother Dmitri in New York. His first job, as George explained to Jenner during the Warren Commission, this is kind of a quote, because you got to listen to this. Mr. de Mohrenschildt says, "I think as soon as I arrived, we went to spend the summer on Long Island, Bellport, Long Island." Mr. Jenner says, "And at Bellport, did you make any acquaintances?" Mr. de Mohrenschildt says, "Yes, lots of people, especially Mrs. Bouvier." Mr. Jenner says, "Who is Mrs. Bouvier?" De Mohrenschildt says, "Mrs. Bouvier is Jacqueline Kennedy's mother. Also, her father and her whole family. She was in the process of getting a divorce from her husband. I met him also. We were very close friends. We still see each other. Uh, Mrs. Auchinloss and occasionally correspond. Well, then, because she had gotten remarried, that's her new married name. And then I decided to go try to work for an oil company, because obviously that's his family's background. It was through Standard Oil, and the links between Allen Dulles and De Morgenschild continued. De Morgenschild's involvement with oil and intelligence led to his work involving a stint in Yugoslavia. At this time, he was representing International Cooperation Administration, which has proven itself to be a CIA front as well, during the Cold War. It was established in 1955 with between the two brothers, John Foster and Allen Dulles, and was linked to U.S. foreign aid assistance and refugees. So again, you have this guy basically acting as an intel asset. In records, a year before De Morgenschild joined ICA, there was a person on the CIA staff that was included in the ICA leadership. So Dulles wrote the following, quote, willing to release, here the CIA staffer's name was redacted, on a reimbursable detail to ICA for a period of approximately 2 years. This decision is made with the understanding that whoever, we think it's George de Morgenschild, will return to the agency upon completion of his temporary duty assignment with your organization. So there you have it. In your 1957 venture, this is going on about a quote from Jenner. As an agent of ICA, tell us what ICA is. De Morgenschild says this. ICA here in Washington wanted an oil and gas specialist to go to Yugoslavia. He denied that he was an intelligence asset, but he did admit that he was shot at when he arrived in Yugoslavia. In 1958, his work involved arranging Yugoslavian workers for a job in Egypt using American equipment. Almost sounds like he's training people. And keep in mind, in 1958 is when they were trying to overthrow the government of Egypt. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Okay. Moving on. George admitted to Jenner that he had been linked with the French intelligence in the United States, but never an official member of it, he said. George was employed by an oil company called Humble Oil that was working with French intelligence, so technically, George said that was correct. He was ideally qualified for this because it was work in the oil industry. It involved Texas and French Morocco before the U.S. entered the war. Here is a link with Allen Dulles, Standard's top international lawyer, but it escaped detection by Jenner during the Warren Commission, perhaps because Allen had taken to maintain his distance as part of the covering up of the past. Part of France and its territories not directly under Nazi military control was now known as Vichy France, and the French intelligence in which George de Morgenschild worked was part of the Vichy government. And the Vichy government, by the way, was very pro-Nazi. And many people believe that's the reason why it was allowed to maintain itself outside of Hitler's control, is because they were really on Hitler's side anyway, at least on the fascism side. That's probably a better way of saying it. In 1941, Standard Oil and Vichy France were helping to supply the German war machine. Nothing can conceal that fact, announced the Mercury newspaper. Quote, that Vichy had become Hitler's willing tool, unquote, from the Spectre. The oil tanker, and I have no idea how to say this name. Schneersadi, let's just call it SH. By coincidence, the same name as the Parisian bistro used by Dulles as a meeting place, was stopped by a British cruiser in the Atlantic and brought into Bermuda. William Teagle, who was the director of Standard Oil, and Standard's lawyer, Alan Dulles, were both involved, working together with George de Morgenschildt and a guy by the name of Pierre Ferras, the French intelligence agents. De Morgenschildt admitted to Jenner that Ferras was the chief of export for Shoemaker and Company, a connection with the French intelligence inside the United States. Teagle took the brunt of accusations that Standard Oil was trading with the enemy, even though the U.S. was not yet at war. The American ships were, quote unquote, accidentally torpedoed by the German submarines routinely, but not a single Standard Oil tanker or any boat that they did business with in the Atlantic was ever torpedoed. Not a single one. So that's a little suspicious. And then, of course, if you step back a second and you look at what happened post-World War II, they're not even finished with it yet. Technically, the war is still going on. You have Alan Dulles making contact with Galen to transfer all of the stay-behind units from Germany over to NATO. I'm sure that's all just a coincidence, too. Because they're obviously coordinating at this point. George, after being personally involved in the Vichy oil tanker scandal of it being captured and moved over to Bermuda, avoided court proceedings. George's father, who was living in Germany, and George himself, who still had a Polish passport, and by the way, Hitler was already halfway into Poland at this point. George's involvement with the Vichy French government would definitely have attracted adverse publicity. But he was shielded from all of that, even though he was intimately involved in it. Standard Oil was working with the Vichy intelligence, so was George, which in some cases you could say by association, he was actually working with the Nazis. Suddenly, if anybody would have found out about that, that would have been a weak link. So when FDR was unofficially siding with the British, you had multiple international syndicate members of the United States also working with the Nazi side. So at this point, George's presence could get a little sticky. So we definitely need to make sure that he's not going to be available back in the 1940s for anybody to talk to him. So Jenner starts talking to him, asking him questions about what happened at that point. He says that he went to work in the oil fields in Louisiana. Well, Jenner's looking at him kind of skeptically because he doesn't necessarily look like the kind of guy that would be working on an oil rig, if you know what I mean. So that was taken with a grain of salt. However, the author is able to track down and find out that de Morgenschildt was actually in Indonesia. He was actually over there doing, and keep in mind, what is George's background? George's background is a geologist. you know, the kind of people that go around finding oil fields. So George is basically sent to the Netherlands, New Guinea, in order to look around for any other new oil fields in the land that Allen Dulles is going to make sure that he gets for Standard Oil. So George hangs out, keeps on the down low over in Indonesia. Also, the author found that he had been given, upon his return to Texas, a $10,000 bonus, which would have been the equivalent of $200,000. And what's really weird about that is because the place where he supposedly was in Louisiana was a dud field. So being a geologist and going to Louisiana and not producing an oil field would not have gotten you a bonus. But going to Indonesia and quote unquote rediscovering and mapping a way to get to what they already know to be the biggest oil field ever discovered, so that you can do the preliminary planning for how you're going to get the oil, may have actually earned you a bonus, because he definitely got paid a bonus. So the author thinks very much that Humble Oil was used, and that George was in their employ and went to Indonesia to basically do that. And he also says that he worked for Humble Oil, and says that he went to Mexico after he got back to the United States and resurfaces in New York to get married. Jenner had to remind him, because he'd already been married at that point, like by 4 times, exactly when he got married. And he married somebody by the name of Jean Ann Fomenko. And that name's going to be important in a minute. Fomenko. Fomenko. In 1956. George had lots of friends in high places, and he went back to school to get his master's degree in geology. He explained to Jenner that he was inspired to do so because of his experience with Humble Oil. He was on a first-name basis with the vice president and other top officials at Humble Oil. Who would that be? Prescott Bush and Allen Dulles. So there's no doubt George's family connections and his study in Belgium had helped him. And the coincidence that he was born the same year that Humble Oil was first began as a company seemed to bode well for George in all of his extremely good luck of having gone over to the Netherlands, New Guinea, and basically charted the 26,000 barrels per day projection that would have made that field the largest single well ever discovered in Southeast Asia. So, basically, again, none of this is told to anybody outside of the private interests of Standard Oil, Allen Dulles, nobody in the United States government, like, the president. None of those people know anything about that. Neither does anyone tell Sukarno that he's basically sitting on all of these riches, because they plan on getting rid of him. So it would be a bad deal to tell him that. So The utter secrecy was required when George de Morgenshield was giving evidence to the Warren Commission about what he had done, how he had done it, which, because of all of this, the propensity of him having told any truth at all when he's hiding this big lie and he's lying about where he was and what he was doing during this time, it all becomes very suspect. Okay. So, President Sukarno had officially arrived in the territory of where the actual big find was that he doesn't know about. And he is told repeatedly by the people there that there's basically nothing there. So when he was giving, now the Dutch is gone, so they don't have the kind of monopoly on all the oil fields. So Sukarno wanted to privatize all of them. So they set up like 3 different companies, and he basically gave them to the political parties and like that, whoever was in charge. And the one that was given to the party that we talked about last time, called the Indonesian Communist Party, even though 90% of them were nationalists and only 10% was communist, it gets labeled the Communist Party. They got assigned an area and a company that basically had no oil. Unfortunately, that was a decision that Sukarno made, and he had inadvertently actually gave the Communist Party the biggest oil field in the world, or in Southeast Asia, unbeknownst to him. So what you're going to find out is when we go over there to do the regime change, we're going to kill all of the people in this PKI party and take over that oil field, because unbeknownst to them being assigned what they thought was a non-productive oil area made them a target of the coup that Alan Dulles is planning to orchestrate, because they actually own the most lucrative part in the whole area geographically. So that's irony of all ironies. And of course, de Morgenshield knows all of this, but he keeps quiet on all of it. And immediately after he's talked to by Jenner, they ship him off to no other place but Haiti. So Humble Oil has business in Haiti. And so de Morgenshield goes to represent Humble Oil in Haiti. And he stays there for a number of years before he comes back to Texas, which I thought that was ironic given where we're at today. So then the author spends a lot of time, and I'm not going to spend the amount of time that he does just on oil in general, and how the Dutch monopoly in bed with the British, in bed with Standard Oil. He kind of touches on all of that a lot. He also brings in Prince Bernhard being a member of the Bilderberg group, and how all of that played into the politics of the time. And again, basically just keeps building the case for how all of this information is hidden. Then he gets to the part which I thought was one of the more interesting parts of Humble Oil itself. And it talks about having did the geographical mapping again, and the fact that there was so much oil over there that in most cases you could just walk around and find it, like not even having to drill. And they do test drilling. They were even hitting oil during the test drilling. That was not anywhere near deep enough that in most places that you would have been able to hit oil. And this comes up in a little bit farther down, so we need to make sure that we understand. There is an area over there that's called SELE. Sealy. Sealy was the name of drilling sites. The most prolific one was Sealy 40. And what happened is when other people like this PKI party or the Japanese or whatever was around, they gave some of the Sealy sites that were unproductive and said basically that's where the quote-unquote oil was, when they purposely steered people away from Sealy 40, which is where all of the real oil was. The Japanese tended to kind of catch on towards the end of what was going on. And basically, they pretend by the time we get to 1970 that they're discovering Sealy 40 for the first time, just like they did with the gold, but that's a complete lie as well. It was discovered back in the 1930s at exactly the same time. So, and again, Japan keeps coming into the story because the Japanese is the recipient of a lot of not just the minerals because of their close proximity, but of the oil as well. So they have a presence there and are interwoven into this story a lot. And I've already talked about how they've tricked the PKI. And that kind of gets us up to the next major area, which is the U.S. military's presence there of the oil, and how basically the author of the case that there's no way that MacArthur doesn't know about all of this. And basically, I mean, he makes a very convincing story. I'm not going to go into all of it because it would take us like 2 weeks to get through this whole book if I give you all the details. I do suggest you go buy this book, JFK versus Allen Dulles by Professor Polgrain, if you're interested in this type of information. But I'm trying to build the case for the coup that happened and how conniving our government is, to include the military, because MacArthur, based on his presence and that of his staff on different occasions to Indonesia, he unequivocally knows that this gas is here. Now, here's another, and we're going to close on this one because this is crazy. A guy by the name of Michael Fomenko, Fomenko. Michael Fomenko just so happens to be a relative of George de Morgenschildt. Well, why is that important? Well, George de Morgenschildt's wife, Jean Ann, her maiden name is Fomenko as well. Fomenko. So they're related. Michael Fomenko went to the Netherlands, New Guinea in 1959. He was kind of this very unique guy. he basically ends up living like Tarzan. And he kind of, what's the word? He basically wanted to live like Tarzan lived. He was very athletic. He took a canoe and canoed. He's Australian. He canoed from Australia to Indonesia, to the Netherlands. Now, because George de Morgenschild was in the Netherlands, New Guinea, mapping out this hellacious new find of an oil rig, if it ever got out that this guy, Michael Fomenko, did this and just so happens to have been on the island and related to George de Morgenschild at the same time that George de Morgenschild was there hiding out, mapping out this massive oil field, that would be a little awkward, especially since George de Morgenschild was on a covert mission and this guy's related to his wife. And he was somewhat of a celebrity because of his athleticism throughout the continent of Australia. He was a very well-known guy. As a matter of fact, one of the guys said he was the most fit human being I have ever met. Unparalleled feat of endurance, crossing the Torres Strait from Australia to New Guinea. He grew up training for the Olympic decathlon. He was inspired by Weissmuller, who was Tarzan. And let's see. Michael Fomenko was originally from the Black Sea area of Georgia, and Weissmuller was originally from Romania. So basically just across the Black Sea from each other. And Eugenia, who had already married George, that was her original name. She changed her name when she came over to Jean and married George. So, oh yeah, and he made his canoe that he canoed over to New Guinea out of a tree himself. He made his own canoe. So in April 1964, at the same time George de Morgenschild was facing the Warren Commission, Michael Fomenko had decided that he wanted to go back to West New Guinea. And Michael's sister, Anessa Fomenko, basically got commissioned to have him committed to a mental hospital so he couldn't go back, because if he went back and it got in the news, they may actually connect him having been there related to George de Morgenschild. So they literally locked this guy up in a mental hospital and electrocuted him through quote unquote shock treatment while he was there. And when he got out, he basically lived the next 50 years in the jungle because he didn't want to be around anybody. He basically divorced himself from his family because they had him locked up. And when he was 86 years old, he was walking from one part of Australia to another part that ended up being about 1,500 miles. And he ended up getting injured. His knee was injured, and he was put into like a rest home at that point. But that is the extent to which they went in order to keep all of this a secret. Locking people up in mental institutions just so they could keep their oil field a secret. These people will stop at nothing to do whatever evil they have planned. So we're going to stop at that point for today. And we will start, we've got 2 chapters left, chapter 4 and chapter 5. Chapter 4 talks about the 1958 rebellion. And then chapter 5 is about, we may not even do chapter 5, because chapter 4 is really what I want to talk about. But chapter 5 is interesting because it goes into Dulles and Hammarskjöld. And if you guys remember Hammarskjöld, he's the guy that they kill in a plane. They attacked his aircraft. He was the Secretary General, the Swedish Secretary General of the UN, that was coming to help fix Congo, and who was on the side of Lumumba before they murdered him. And after they murdered Lumumba, he was flying into the Congo to try to put Katanga and Congo back together and undo what Alan Dulles and all of those guys were doing, or Otto Skorzeny. And on his way there, they missile attack or shot a missile from the ground or from an aircraft. And there's different opinions on that, but basically he died in a plane crash. And so it'll be interesting to see how their relationship about this, because this happens in close proximity to what was going on then, which we already know. So anyway, that's it. Oh, Trump Frog's here.
What's up, Colonel?
Hey.
What's up, Stellar? What's up, Bridget? How y'all doing?
Good. So before I forget, tonight at 9 o'clock, I will be on SitRep, just so that you guys know, with Alpha and CanCon. We're going to go a little bit more into depth into that wacky video series that CanCon discovered. So that should be interesting with all of its...
It is so creepy.
It's so creepy.
Interesting, but it is very creepy.
I'm going to have to listen tonight to find out. I'm still freaking out over the Nutter Butter thing.
Right? That is insane.
I'm telling you, the whole world, being asleep, for many people is so peaceful. Once you're not asleep anymore, it is really a roller coaster ride. So anyway.
Do you think that the Japan ties with everything because, they were in Korea, before World War II, and then the ties that they had to, like Germany and stuff during World War II, and then afterwards, do you think that maybe, it was just a continuation of operations because, I still question who actually won the war. So do you think that might be part of it?
I think the more I dig into this, the more I'm convinced that Germany and Japan were, and basically always been, fascist. South Korea has always been fascist. Taiwan has always been fascist. Because as we discovered, Taiwan was under martial law for 40 years. They give you the appearance of one thing, and that's like the United States. We've not had an election in decades. We've had selections, not election, until 2016. They decided who, and then it was just going to be a matter of the semantics of walking through. It's all been a charade. So And the noose of fascism has been tightening every year with new legislation, new changes to our Constitution, to the point that now we live in a country that has no constitutional basis at all. No part of our government functions as a republic. None of the agencies, none of the judicial area, none of it is a republic. And pretending that it is living a lie. Pretending that you actually vote for people to be president, it's a lie. I'm not saying don't vote, because I think, as we have said multiple times, Trump broke their system. And you can overwhelm their system and catch them out of sync with their cheating, which is exactly what happened in 2016. And you saw what it was like putting someone in office that didn't have their agenda. You had low inflation, you had no wars, you had the conclusion of multiple quote unquote wars, none of which are constitutional, by the way. You had the securing of our border, and we've all went through all of the accomplishments of Trump. That's 4 years all that shit happened. So if any of the previous 10 quote unquote Republican presidents could have done all of that and more in 8 years, and yet they did nothing except for continue the shit that the Democrat had started before him. As I pointed out with Ronald Reagan, it wasn't Ronald Reagan that created the Department of Education, but he's the one that funded it. And he's the one that hired everybody for it, because Jimmy Carter did it so late in his administration, he didn't even get to pick the secretary. He didn't hire the first person. That was all done under Reagan. There's no difference in any of them. So, go ahead.
I think I told you that it always felt like, well, for a very long time, once I started following bloodlines and seeing how they're all related, that's why I was like, oh my gosh, it's not like, go beyond that. It's like the kingdoms of Europe or Asia are still at war with each other, and we're just the pawns in their, world domination, is how I've always felt, especially, it's like we still have feudism because they're all related, even though we have quote unquote a constitutional republic. It just never felt like that. And now I understand. Yeah.
So
those people need to end. They all need to just go away.
That was kind of one of the, there's nuggets along the way of doing this research. There's like nuggets that you can like put up on a shelf and go, that's pivotal. One of the nuggets that I found early on in this, when I was reading Anthony Sutton's trilogy of Wall Street and the Bolsheviks, Wall Street and Hitler, and Wall Street and FDR, one of the nuggets when I got to FDR was Teddy Roosevelt and FDR was related to every single president before them except for 2. So that is exactly what you just said.
And they all have relations to royalty through the English monarchy or the House of Orange. They all have relations of something or another through the houses of Europe, if you want to say.
Yes.
And then I can't wait till you do the Maxwell dig on that one, because I didn't even know that he was a USSR Soviet spy. I thought he was Mossad and MI6.
No, he is. He's all of it. See, Stellar, that's the problem. That's why none of it matters that they call themselves, and that's what people get hung up on. None of that matters. The intel people, if you understand that the same people in New York City and London funded the Bolsheviks, that funded Hitler, that funded FDR, that created worldwide fascism, if you understand it all came from the Fabian Society, it doesn't make a freaking difference that of 30,000 intel, we put 5 of them in the Mossad thimble, we put 5 of them in the CIA thimble, we put 5 of them in the B&D thimble. It doesn't matter. They're all working for the same people. And people who try to do that, that's why I, again, came up with the International Syndicate and Operation Gladio. All of the tactics and operational elements is Operation Gladio. All of the strategic planning is the International Syndicate. It doesn't matter what country they're in. They have no boundaries. They want one world government. They act as a hive, both at the strategic level, the operational level, and the tactical level. They are a hive, and they swarm out as a hive. The fact that they have labels is just to get us to fight over it. So,
like I said, it just blows my freaking mind.
Mine too.
Like, oh my gosh, like I said, I know about the Operation Gladio and things like that. I knew, but I just thought that they were these different countries that were working separately but still together, had no idea the ties over like that person. I'll let you go on. I'm sorry. That's all. Just
Bridget, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just gonna. Well, and actually, you just about covered what I was gonna say. Early on, we agreed that kind of World War II was where we were starting, but that's not where it began. And doing the research to go further back is a good thing. And going further back into our country's history and these people's history is a great thing because there are connections there. But the big thing is not to get distracted with those and so hyper-focused on those that you lose sight of the 40,000-foot view. And that is why we focus so much on their patterns, because that pattern recognition is going to keep us out of falling into the same trap over and over and over again like we have, and other countries have, not us solely. And this is the CIA, but it is not solely the CIA. And the interconnections therein. But anyway, that's pretty much all I had to say. Thank you.
Sure. Truth, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for letting me speak.
Sure.
I'm so happy to hear what you guys are talking about here, especially coming from a colonel. I am a college dropout, and I started a business, and I worked with the government all across the United States. And what I realized about 15 years ago is that we live in a fascist kleptocracy ourselves. And it was very discouraging. I was somebody who grew up believing in the story of America. And as a colonel, what surprises me is that how much the military and people in the military actually know what's going on and what you're speaking about. And I'll refer to the veteranstoday.com, Veterans Today magazine. And if you do searches on there, and I don't want to disparage an entire group of people because we know it's just the people at the top, but they call them the Khazarian Mafia. And that is kind of who's been running this since basically when Tucker Carlson interviewed Vladimir Putin, he spoke of history for quite a while. And in a way, that's exactly what he was speaking about, a history that we've been lied to about. And that's why I think he spoke about it so much. And it goes back to Ukraine, which is modern day Khazaria.
Well,
anyways, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Let me, but again, I'm going to push back just a little bit, because obviously you're new, to our area here. That is the problem, and that is the reason why I use the term international syndicate, because it is not just the Khazarian Mafia. And it's not just one religion. In Operation Gladio, one of the very operation, they decided, watching Chiang Kai-shek over in the nationalist Chinese fight with Mao, that they could sell opium to support the war on a black ops, a covert side. They needed a money launderer because that's a cash business. The money launderer of choice became the Vatican, and the Vatican not only orchestrated the rat lines out of Nazi Germany for many of the people going to South America, but elsewhere into Egypt. It is not just one religion. It is not just one ethnic background. It's all of them. They are a team, a hive that operate together. So I'm very hesitant to say that all of these people come from one geographical area or one religious area, because we know, we've done research into many of the Christian, like the Unification Church for another. The Unification Church out of South Korea is an Operation Gladio front. They train terrorists, they deploy them. They were down in South America in Paraguay and Uruguay guarding opium fields. They are militant, paramilitary, disguised as a church, disguised as a Protestant church. So, again, when you start looking through this, you will find all kinds of different elements of this big piece. But to your first point about operating inside of this without knowing about it, there are many people, and I've had this conversation both with general officers that have retired as well as, enlisted people that work for me. Once I found out about all of this stuff and sharing this stuff with people that I served with, I have learned so much, because as you begin sharing this information, people they'll go, oh my God, I flew some of those guys into Honduras, like one of the heavy pilots that flew C-141s. Oh my God, we went on a deployment, a guy that I served with that was in the Army. Yeah, I met some of those guys. I was down training people in El Salvador. I had no idea what they were going to be doing. So a lot of us were inside of this beast. And because things are compartmentalized, you don't understand, nor do you see what they're actually doing and how you're manipulated. The whole brainwashing of everything communist is bad, and if they label something a communist, then you can kill it. Well, we see now these same people labeling people as domestic terrorists because they show up at the Capitol wearing red, white, and blue. So there is so many facets to this. Shannon, go ahead.
First off, before I go any further, Colonel, I just want to say great job with Alpha Warrior last night. Great show.
Thank you.
And Batman and Robin, I didn't mean for my comment to make him the Robin, so I feel bad about that.
He's definitely Robin on that show, and he's fine. I'll be Robin tonight.
Yeah, so I just want to bring a highlight to you tonight. I don't know where you're going to be tonight, but I did hear you mention it. Where are you going to be tonight? On
Badlands SitRep. Badlands Media has a show called SitRep. The two Marines, former Marines, that run that show is CanCon and Alpha Warrior, and I will be their guest.
Oh, great. Okay, cool. So bring highlights to that, because I didn't know where it was going to be, so I want to make sure I send that out and let people know. So cool about that.
Thank you.
Just a little pushback on the comment. I think it was from the lovely and wonderful Stellar regarding royalty. There is no royalty amongst the international syndicate. First off, through all my deep dives, Stellar, they've all usurped all the papers from anything calling them royalty. So So I will tell you that.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but for like the normies, they don't realize that, and they did put stuff in, and had children that were not part of the bloodline things with that. And
Yeah. Okay.
So I do understand. I do understand.
Yeah. Stella, let me finish, and then you can come back. You can come back at it. The reason why I say that, because what I'm finding is, for a lot of people, when they hear podcasts and they hear, sort of like, how like the Colonel corrects people on the terminology and the lexicon for Gladio. It's the same thing I'm trying to do with people, because when they hear royalty, they go into this fairy tale image of royalty. First off, they're not royalties. They're evil Satanists, no matter where the international syndicate falls beginning to end. They're evil, and they've usurped everything. They've mocked God, and they've stolen all the papers. And when the true bloodline does come out for true royalty, we will know soon. And as through my research, believe it or not, our POTUS is kind of right up there in the tribal bloodline. So we'll see about that. So that's the only thing I wanted to say. And I hear you on the recant. I just am really careful with people, because there's this image, especially in Wokeism Canada, they have this fantasy with royalty. So I'm really trying to break that and the verbiage in the podcast. So thank you very much. Love you all.
Thank you.
Most Americans, myself included, can't stand their families, and my lineage does go back to William the Conqueror. So, and I'm not a Satanist, so I know with that and things like that. So, just wanted to make clarity there. Thank you,
Alfred. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, yesterday there was an issue with my computer. Today I'm on a different one. So first I want to say thanks for all the work you've done. I've been going through your alpha vlogs, and it's really opened my eyes. So I really appreciate, all your work.
Thank you.
You were talking before about, I also like the term international crime syndicate, because I think that pretty much sums it up. The concept of the hive is also interesting, but I think on some level, what it is it's a secret society that's infiltrated institutions, other secret societies, and things like that.
So you're right about that. They belong to secret societies. The secret societies allow them to meet and plan, obviously, in secrecy. The same thing that the World Wildlife Fund did, the same thing that the World Anti-Communist League does. Secret societies tend to take on a more satanic nature, since these others operate more in the daylight. But yeah, there's an element of that. The problem is we had a choice when we started this journey, because this thing is so huge, and there are so many levels to it, that in order to convey what it is, you have to kind of narrow down a focus and concentrate on something that people can wrap their head around. That's why I have been asked repeatedly, and I simply refuse to, I'm going to use the word take the bait, to branch off into other aspects of what the CIA has done, like MK Ultra and stuff like that. Only as it overlaps with Operation Gladio, like in the case of Jonestown, will I cover that topic, because my expertise in 30 years in the military is the paramilitary aspect of Operation Gladio and the International Syndicate. I have a master's degree in business, so I can talk about the International Syndicate and the business world. I'm very aware of what that is. But again, my expertise work-wise is the military. And so that's kind of what we stay focused on. We don't lose sight of the big picture. But I think it's easier, not easy, to get your head around the concept of an international syndicate running a paramilitary black ops thing in order to overthrow governments, in order to control people. And
That makes sense.
yeah, and so if I broaden that, I mean, I'm already spending about 12 hours a day doing this. If I broaden it in any manner, we will get overwhelmed.
So, it's just amazing how much content you've put out, and it's really impressive all the work that you've done. There's two things that the other day, I think 2 days ago, I went through was it episode 20 with O.J. Simpson,
Uh-huh.
and I had no idea about the Colombian necktie thing.
I didn't either.
And I'll tell you, that really upset me on a lot of levels because obviously them keeping that bit of discovery from the public,
Right?
nobody would have believed that OJ had done that.
Right. Which is why it was hidden.
Clearly a deflection. So they basically defrauded the judiciary.
Yes.
The prosecution, defenders, the judge, all the cops, they all knew them.
Yes. All of
They
them.
would have been top in the discovery. They would all have been privy to that information. They all lied about it.
And Alfred, that's kind of my bottom line in all of this. I bring you enough detail because, believe me, probably 20% of what I read is stuff I don't even want to talk about. I bring you enough detail for you to get the picture without throwing up. And
Right.
the level of depravity of these people is beyond the pale. And so if people can understand that there is nothing, and I do mean nothing, that is beyond their willingness to do in order to implement this one world government. Now, this is so critical because I believe in the next year, we are going to be presented with Trump being back in office and having to do some really tough things. Whether it's the military tribunals that a lot of people think already happened, or the ability to get rid of the CIA, or dismantling the FBI and maybe focusing some stuff in the air marshals or whatever, or the marshal, whatever. I think that the more people that understand Operation Gladio and the depravity of these people, the more they will be on board with sucking it up, going through some hardship in order to right the ship. But if you don't even understand the ship is sinking, there's no way you're going to have the willpower to start bailing the water out. And that's why I think what I'm doing, what we're doing, is critical to what's about ready to happen.
I think so too. There's one other thing I'd like to bring up, and it's not popular, and people get angry at me for saying this, but if it's okay, I'd like to just mention it. I think the other day I sent a link, something that you had posted about the JFK, like a JFK X thing on Prime. There's a guy named Jay Weidner, I think. He's like a Hollywood producer, and he basically put a pretty convincing argument that the JFK assassination was a Hollywood prop, basically what they call a squib that was put on the side of his head. And, there was a string that his wife, I forget his wife's name.
Jackie?
Jackie, yeah. There's 3 frames missing from that famous footage.
Magruder frame?
He thinks that was a squib. In other words, a prosthetic with a small explosive and blood pack. And that technology was there in 1963. It's a pretty interesting point of view, and it's one that I've never really heard anyone ever talk about. And I'm going to say something else that may not go over very well. Hopefully no one will hate me for it. But I'd like to point it out is that with the Trump assassination, I was just listening to this like in the last day or two. This technology is there for, and I'm not saying it, I don't have any information. Okay, I'm just saying that the technology exists, but it sure would explain a lot if there was a prosthetic on his ear as opposed to actual bullets flying around. Given the information that we get from the public, we really don't know anything. So I know it's not popular, and I'm not saying this is the truth or not the truth. I'm just saying that the technology is readily available.
Everybody has their is entitled to their own opinion. We don't hate on anybody that comes in here and offers other opinions. I think at the end of the day, we're all going to know at some point in the near future. But in order to go down the road of assassinations, you would have to believe that a whole lot of people are somewhere, because there's a shitload of people that's been assassinated.
That's true.
And I only deal in what I know to be factual. I almost always, although I have done some educated kind of guesses based on patterns, but I do tend to think that JFK was assassinated because the people during that period of time, for example, Charles de Gaulle, they tried to assassinate him over 20 times. Like really close to over 30 times. I've read extensively about 7 of them, to include basically mowing down all of his bodyguards, blowing up his car, wrecking his car, killing other bodyguards. Just Italy, just the deep dive that I did on Italy alone, there were so many dead bodies. There were so many blown up planes. There were so many murdered reporters that it would be hard for me to believe that because JFK in almost every case in foreign policy, whether it was Indonesia, whether it was Israel, whether it was South Africa, whether it was Angola, whether it was Algeria, whether it was the stuff that was going on in South America, Cuba, he was talking behind the scenes at peace with Fidel Castro. Well, that would have fucked up the entire CIA at that point. So he, even just one screw up, like Allende saying, I want my copper mine back, is enough to get him dead. He just wanted his telephone company back and his copper mine back, and they killed him. So the fact that JFK was literally messing with every single thing that they had going and had been doing for like the last 20 years, yeah, he would have definitely been on their hit list. So whether or not, now, if you want to make the argument that he knew that and someone orchestrated that happening to get him safely out of the way in order for something else to play out, I can absolutely understand why people would believe that. I don't personally believe it, but I do understand that those types of things are possible. But anyway, let me get to a couple other people. Truth, go ahead.
Thanks again. I really
Sure.
appreciate all your work.
Sure, no problem. Thank you for being here.
Hello, I just kind of wanted to follow up with what I said earlier, and I appreciate the distinction you made. I usually use that term.
Hello? Hello?
All along, hold on.
can't
Somebody
hear.
else is talking. All right, we'll take you down. Go ahead. Truth.
I use that terminology just because it gives a historical context, and it also kind of explains a little bit of Ukraine and why we're there. My understanding is this, you can go back as far in history as you want, actually, to the pagan and King Nimrod or Gilgamesh, and that's who these people trace their bloodline back to. and from my understanding also is that these Khazarian bankers interbred all of the royal families and then ultimately ended up killing the original bloodline and have taken over all of what you would call the royal families. And going back to Napoleon and where they took over the British Empire with basically lying to the British stock exchange and royal, I don't know what you would call them, the landed gentry at the time, that Napoleon had won the war and then created a selling frenzy and bought the entire British stock market and bond market for what 2 or 3 cents on the dollar, and then ended up owning, basically the most powerful empire in the world at that point, and for the next really until where we're at right now. But I appreciate it, and correct me if I'm wrong with any of my facts.
No. Yeah, again, I'm not going to correct you on any of that information. I was just trying to clarify, because one of the things that I have to be careful about is in a psychological warfare, in information warfare, words matter, actual specific words. And it also disarms people who want to come and divide us. And so I'm just very careful about the terminology, and I want everybody that's part of our movement, if you want to call it that, that's probably an over exaggeration, part of our knowledge base, to all agree on, and you don't have to agree on it, you have to understand it. If you're going to listen to the information that we discuss, that we use particular terms, and I want all the new people to understand why I picked the terms, because we've now been at this over a year, and we have had concerted efforts to try to divide us and to try to take us off message. And because I've had all of that training and I understand exactly what they're trying to do, and I'm not saying you are, I'm very careful when new people come into our community that I explain to them what we're doing and why we use the terms. I'm not asking anybody to change any of their other history that goes much farther back, or to believe anything that I believe. I do want people to consider, when they discuss this, to use similar terms, because I've already experienced, I want people to understand Operation Gladio, because it allows you to see things that are going on around us right now in a completely different light. And if you get bogged down in a conversation about bloodlines and religion and all that other stuff, you've lost the narrative. You've lost the psychological warfare angle to whoever's engaging with you. And I want people, I want more people, not less people, to understand what is going on. Again, this is about a mile deep. I'm only about 500 feet level. And that 500 feet level, if I can get the message to the people, they get inquisitive as to how much more lies they've been told, and they go off, like Shannon has talked about, SR-71, Bridget, everybody. We all have our own areas of interest, and we'll do more research on our own. But if I can't get them into the 500-foot pool, I'm never going to get them into the mile-long pool. So that's kind of our goal here. Carrie, go ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to say, I'm Occupy Wall Street, and we called it the 1%. And, our thing was economic justice. But we did that on purpose because, A, we didn't want to block people, you know, anyone, and except the 1%. And we did have weird issues with some Jewish things, and we didn't because we were going against banks, so we didn't want to hinder our message. So we wanted it to be open.
Correct. Yeah. And
So,
that's definitely a consideration when you're trying to reach people.
yes, and I want to say one more thing about that. When we were there, I was in New York City on Wall Street, and we were surrounded by police 24/7. And I talked to the police, and some of the police that I talked to knew more than I did. And I would be on the barricade, and they would look at me right in the face. They were my supposed enemy, and they would say, "Thank you." So when we think about other people, we can't really think automatically they don't know anything. They don't know what I know. It's a very closed position to be in, and it's really, really unhelpful. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks. And I do need to say something when wherever he went was talking truth. I'm also doing a Rumble live cast, and I was laughing quietly. So I don't want anybody to think I was actually laughing at what he said. I was not. We just had an Amazon delivery, and our dog, we have a little miniature schnauzer. I'm watching him, the Amazon guy, my husband walks out there because he was in the front yard with my dog, and the dog just jumped into the Amazon van and was going to go riding off with the Amazon guy. My husband had to go get the dog out of the Amazon van, so I was trying not to laugh out loud. Anyway, Tough, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I always love these spaces. I feel like I get smarter every episode. And then it makes me sad that our nation has no clue about this information. We've got to find a way to get it out to the public, but we got to start somewhere, right? So thank you, Colonel and Stellar, for doing this, and of course Bridget as well. All right, so I want to add my little contribution. Stellar, when you talked about Rothschilds, the House of Rothschilds, my ears perked up because I've been studying the Bible, and I was looking at Revelations just the other day, and I noticed some wording I never noticed before. So I created a little post so you guys can see it, where Jesus says in Revelation, House of David. I can't do it verbally. I got to look at it. It says, shoot. Okay, I'm gonna have it. Here we go. It says in Revelation 5, verse 5. Then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." So there we go. So it's showing that it's really important we understand that David is important in this whole, journey we're on. And we all are familiar with that Revelation term. You call yourselves Jews, but you're of the synagogue of Satan. A lot of people who are anti-Jew, every Jew is bad. They're like, see, Jews are bad. I'm like, no, he's differentiating, saying there's Jews that are good, and Jesus aligns with that, but there are the imposters. And so I'm really intrigued by who are these imposters, and can we identify them? And Stellar, what you were saying about the House of Rothschilds, it really
like connected. I've heard it many times, but it just kind of hit me that this is real. And we are seeing now that it's a serious game they're playing. Like you guys are teaching me just listening how serious this is, how real this is, how corrupt they are, and
How they're all working together.
yes, but it's hard for us to fathom because we have, we're in the space because we have a sense of goodness. And then it gets me thinking, I'm always into the quantum, scientific, genetic, DNA, how could this be possible within the mechanisms of humanity? How could a family be evil throughout time? Because it seems like everyone has their own choices, right?
But being bad is their being bad, and enslavement and control like they're doing, which is the playbook of the Gladio, 100%. That's for total control of everything, enslaving the entire planet under their system, and it's their playbook over and over and over again. And that's where I love Colonel Towner, because it makes all sense. It's really bizarre.
Yeah, but so how Jesus, and I agree with you, but the way I think is, what's the plan of God? Because God wants to save people, he wants to save mankind, but we have choices, right? But if someone's in a bloodline, does that remove their choice? No, they still have the option, right? But maybe they're prone to it. Maybe their family culture perverts them along the way. Like if we look at Cain and Abel, in my historical research in Josephus, it says that Cain had a propensity for evil, and he went out and expanded kingdoms. And his journey was he created populations, and he continued to do evil. And so the way I see it is that battle was centuries old, as we all know. And then along comes Abraham, and God says directly to him, I need you to set apart a pathway for humanity, and your descendants will carry it on. So all the way through King David, God promises King David and his descendants that they will be blessed. But then Solomon screws it up by partnering with the Egyptians and adds the whole Babylonian weird thing, right? And so my theory is that this is when this evil synagogue of Satan set in. So I'll wrap it up. I know I'm getting long, but I just want to say that in terms of the House of Rothschilds, that term, the House of David, is also used, and there's an archaeological finding where it was put in stone. So I put that clip in there too, so we can all see that this House of Rothschild's House of David is I believe it's the two battling entities here. And I'll end it there.
All right. All about or all along? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the reference to the Kennedy assassination and related to the Zapruder film. I know we've been through this a couple times before, but you mentioned, I think yesterday, that both Abraham Zapruder himself and de Mohrenschildt were members of the Dallas Council of World Affairs, which is like the CIA local microphone of Dallas, and that Dulles was there just weeks before the assassination. And in relationship to that, I just wanted to reemphasize, this guy, C.D. Jackson, who I think is just so, we probably have heard of him, but not enough people in the general population, in my opinion, really understand just what a kind of pivotal dude this guy is in terms of the wider narrative. First of all, he was the top 8 of Henry Luce, coming out of Time magazine, which was, pivotal in terms of reaching mass numbers coast to coast, which was kind of a new thing in the 1920s. And, he was the world's leading expert on psychological warfare, which he earned that reputation in World War II, helping General Eisenhower And so when you think about it, I mean, here is literally the world's leading authority getting exclusive control of the Zapruder film, and then it's shown once during the New Orleans trial of Jim Garrison, and then really only for the first time on national TV and Geraldo Rivera's ABC primetime show. I mean, it's just, pretty coinky-dinky, as it were, that the world's leading authority on psychological warfare just happens to get exclusive control of the Zapruder film. And it's just like, what today, people disagree about whether the film was altered or not, or, was, the caller, Alfred E. Newman's comments about, how the dude was shot. I mean, it seems as if this disinformation or disagreement was really the goal of C.D. Jackson gaining control of the Zapruder film. And just one last comment on C.D. There was a historian who has written a book about C.D. Jackson. It's not nearly well known enough, because again, if CIA is in the book reviews, and they are, right, it's going to really cut down on the number of people that have access to information, right? Because you can write a book and it'll be 7 zillion on Amazon and no one will, it's like a one-hand clapping in the forest type deal. CIA gets that. That's why they're in book reviews. So anyway, the author of this book on C.D. Jackson was trying to get C.D. Jackson's files in Time Incorporated, right? And the person at that time in charge of Time Incorporated's files refused access to this historian, whose last name is Stern and works at John Jay College of the CUNY here in New York City. So anyway, guess who that guy was who refused access to the C.D. Jackson files? Mr. Walter Isaacson. So if you remember that name, there's probably no more popular biographer in the United States than Walter Isaacson, right? He's written a gigantic selling, immediately widely reviewed biographies of Steve Jobs, blah, 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 etc. So, I mean, there's definitely a media connection and synergy between that runs right through the C.D. Jackson to today, and I just think, short version summary, we should do everything we can, if possible, to spread awareness of C.D. Jackson. I mean, because if you let this trickery happen at the level of media, everything else is easy, We've got to kind of go higher upstream and look at the very high mucky mucks of U.S. media and hit Operation Mockingbird right at the key in the key areas. And the Zapruder film and C.D. Jackson seem to me a very prime example of that.
So I did, I don't know how long ago, a relatively, for me, short thread on C.D. Jackson. Because if you look at Operation Gladio and its formation in the immediate aftermath of World War II under the Eisenhower administration, but its creation and coordination under Eisenhower while he was still on active duty as the European commander, you can begin to see how someone like C.D. Jackson, because he worked in the Office of War Information, which is basically the precursor to the psychological warfare that got better developed after World War II. So you have, like, we're very familiar with USAID. There is also a information agency that was created that is a CIA front as well. And this Office of War Information was the precursor to it during World War II. So if you look at the fact that he worked for Eisenhower in the psychological warfare division of the SHAPE, which is the precursor to NATO, basically. What I find most amazing about this guy is this one short thing here, because we're going to get into it when we talk about the World Anti-Communist League. Listen to this sentence. From 1951, so the CIA's set up in 48, from 1951 to 1952, he served as president of the Anti-Communist Free Europe Committee. That is the European version of the World Anti-Communist League. And we know unequivocally that the World Anti-Communist League was the beginning transitory fascist one world government entity that had four basic sub-elements. One was the Asian people of the Anti-Communist League that was over in it morphed into the World Anti-Communist League headquarters. The one in Europe is called the Anti-Communist Free Europe Committee. And he was the speechwriter for Dwight Eisenhower during his presidential campaign. Why? Because he's involved in psychological warfare. Dwight D. Eisenhower had a PSYOPs guy as his speechwriter when he was running for president in 1952. That should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The guy was part of Bilderberg. He was part of the Radio Free Europe, which is CIA, blah, blah, blah. So he is one of the most evil people when it comes to messaging for this one world government Operation Gladio monstrosity. He was critical in order to get people. He would be the one drafting all of the, hey guys, you know, it's best to traumatize little kids by having these nuclear fallout drills and making them all get under their chairs in order to teach them to hate communists. That's this guy. This is what this guy does. Psychological warfare. They've been attacking us for decades. All right. I don't see any more hands. We're at our 2-hour time frame. So any last words? Bridget, Stellar?
I have a quick question, if you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead.
You know how, like, we were talking about, like, the military stuff, because, like, don't you think that the National Guards, the state National Guards, you know, they're going to be probably busier doing stuff also, like maintaining the state and stuff like that, making sure it's safe when they're doing their things, and within the federal government or whatever too, when they need to, don't you think? Because it just seems like there's, with these woke people, and it seem like they take the payoffs from, you know, the international syndicate, like the CIA and things like that. You know, it seems like there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be taken care of because they're a part of this craziness. It's crazy out there.
I don't know what you mean taken care of. I don't understand what your question is.
Well, you know, like the Millies, like he's not a very good person. You know, he seems to be on the side of, you know, the international syndicate, right, against the people. Those were the types of ones I was.
But he's not guard. He's active duty military. So
military. Yeah, well, I was meaning like a lot of these active military people that were like that. You know, because I see, like, with you know, with a lot of this stuff happening and clearing out within the system, mm-hmm. You know, on the different levels. I mean, like within the governments, within the military, you know, the UN stuff, all of these different people. Without all of those people, we're not going to really need to have a huge, big military because most people don't want wars. I don't think.
So we shouldn't have a standing military to what we have now, if that's where you're going with this. The way that the United States as a republic was set up is that the states had primacy and the states had National Guard. And if we were going to go to war, the National Guard is what provided the feeder into the initial war machine while the training up of a bigger response would happen simultaneously. You had war planners in a war department before World War II. The War Department had operational plans to go places and do things based on whatever the situation was at the time. Until World War II, we did not have a large standing military because the entire concept of our country requires an act of Congress in order to go to war. And so you don't have the budget to pay for a standing army if you don't have a war. And so the National Guard was kind of the primer. What happened after World War II is the creation of a standing army ballooned the government out the yin-yang and created the military-industrial complex to feed that machine. It's like setting up a sawmill and then everything becomes a tree. So you are never, if you own the sawmill, not going to find trees. And that's the same thing that we have going on now, that there's going to always be a war because you have this entire machinery set up to feed innocent lives into this sawmill. And that has to go away. I'm not saying we have to get rid of the military. What I am saying...
That it was just coincidentally, like all these different things, you know, World War II is the perfect place because it seems like that's where our government went through a major restructure as far as, you know, it seems like
it fundamentally changed the entire world.
And then that's also when we became the world reserve currency also.
Yes, it fundamentally changed the world. And it was done on purpose. It fundamentally changed every aspect of the world on purpose. Because if you're starting back at the Fabian Society and you want one world government, you got a whole mountain to move. You have 190 countries that you're going to meld into one entity. Well, somebody came up with a wiring diagram on what it's going to take to do that. And they tell you in their own words, 3 world wars is all they needed to transform the entire world into one world government. Between World War II and World War III, I would argue that World War III started the day after World War II, the entire impetus focused on the covert overthrow of every form of government and instituting fascism, because fascism facilitates a international syndicate that selects leaders that appear to be elected so that you could lull everybody to sleep with your psyops. You could, in the dark, orchestrate the overthrow of the government by judicial fiat. And in doing that and the selection over the course of several decades, you would, while people are watching you, change their entire form of government and they won't even know it. And that's what's happened. And if anybody gets a little restful, like they did after Vietnam, and they went, this is bullshit, we ain't going to do this. They just psyops you more, create music industries out of whole cloth, and false flags, terrorism. You know, look what happened during during the Vietnam. They created the Weather Underground, they created the Cuban Exiles, and they were going all over the United States blowing shit up. And no one ever put all of that together to understand that was an orchestrated terrorist effort to get us to seek more government. And they did it all over the world. And that's the whole basis of Operation Gladio.
Can I ask a question real quick? Do you have these in your highlights so that I can go back and listen to these? Thank you so much. This is really awesome. Thank you.
So Bridget did a pin post on my homepage on X. It has all of my threads in one area, and it has the spaces that we've done. That we just started the Spaces program a few months ago, going country by country. If you go over to my Rumble channel called The Colonel's Corner, you go back to the very first one. We started with a very basic book about Operation Gladio, and it's the best book that's ever written, called it's by Paul Williams, and it's called Operation Gladio. We did a book review, but by the time I got to that book review, I had already read about 10 or 15 Gladio books. So I add a lot of context to Paul Williams' already brilliantly written book. Then we moved on to other books. And as you go through those series of book reviews and other podcasts, some of them are just like Gladio 101. I give community lectures here in the local area. I went on people's podcasts that I had them send me a copy of it after the fact, and I uploaded it, that are just new audiences, very generic overviews of all of the information that I've gleaned. And up until a week ago, when I organized all my books out in a separate building, not that I've got that many books, but I kept telling people, yeah, I've read 25, 30 books, 20, 25 books, whatever. I've actually got 68 books. I've read about 57 of those 68 books.
And a bazillion articles.
And some electronic books, which I avoid at all cost, like on archive.org, that you can't buy anymore. And I save them in a special folder on my archive.org profile. I'm actually petrified to go look and see how many's in that folder, because I'm sure I'm going to add a whole bunch more. But anyway, I've basically been doing this now well over a year for about 12 hours a day. And so I'm kind of a walking encyclopedia of Operation Gladio, which is a good and bad thing, because it gets very frustrating when people talk around the edges of it, and act like an authority on it without ever actually saying what it is or the extent to which it's used. So there's pros and cons to that, but I'm in it for the long haul until we get the government back that we were promised at the founding. Go ahead, Stellar. You're going to close it up because I got to run.
I was just going to say, I put up on top the thread reader that has read and share the Twitter. And if you scroll down, the Apple app, or whatever it's called, APP, will the app box will open up, and everything, all of her PDFs, record, everything is in there. So I just put it up on top for you.
Thank you, Stellar.
And I also messaged you.
Thank you, Stellar. Yeah, so, and I have a Substack. I have written several articles. I do have a couple of articles that have been published on Badlands about Operation Gladio. I was commissioned to do a series, but I've been a little busy. I do need to get back to that. But we just started a new book series that the last two are out there, and we'll be doing more of those. As a matter of fact, I'm going to try to squeeze one in between now and 9 o'clock. Anyway, it's taken a life of its own, but I'm committed to get the information out there. And I do think it's better if we do the book reviews together. Not that I discourage anybody from reading ahead, but everybody, especially people that work, it's impossible to get the context of all of the information. And once you're 30 or 40 books into it, every author, even ones that write about Operation Gladio without calling it Operation Gladio because they just were not aware of it, because some of these books were written in 1960. It hadn't even been exposed at that point. But they're definitely talking about it. They're talking about assassinations. They're talking about the drug trafficking, Chiang Kai-shek, blah, blah, blah. So going back and reading those books and understanding what people knew back then is very enlightening, because you find out that people were a lot smarter than what we thought. And a lot of people were calling all of this stuff out, but a lot of them got killed. And that's why I'm reluctant to think that assassinations to any large extent were staged, because this entire operation is well documented, significant body production. I mean, lots and lots of dead bodies, lots and lots of dead bodies. So anyway, Carrie, 2 minutes. I got to go.
I just wanted to say, Occupy Wall Street, we designated the Federal Reserve, the establishment of the Federal Reserve as the beginning. And it was really hard for them to shove that central bank through the system. And they started in like the 1800s. That's all I want to say. Not World War II. We didn't designate it there.
No, World War II didn't start this. This idea was created in the Fabian Society in the 1890s. Their first, and it didn't start there. You can go back to Theodore Roosevelt's uncle in 1850 wrote the first paper in the United States in New York as a banker, talking about basically fascism and how it needed to be implemented in the United States. So the Fabian Society in London, which created the RIIA and the CFR as the mechanisms in the early 1900s, like 1905, 1910 timeframe, because they're the ones that orchestrated the Bolshevik Revolution. They're the ones that orchestrated World War I. None of this started in World War II. What I said was World War II changed the world forever, because World War I only gave them a weak League of Nations and the Bank of International Settlements, which was the central bank for central banks. After World War II, in order to do one world government, you have to have a standing military. World War II gave them the United Nations, it gave them the World Bank, it gave them the IMF, it gave them NATO for the standing military. It gave them the ability to set up the stay-behind units and the paramilitary black ops using drug money, weapons trafficking, and human trafficking to generate black ops money to pay for everything in a covert way in order to forever change the world. I didn't say it started in World War II. It did not. I've been unequivocally clear that we can trace the stay-behind unit concept alone back to the Boer Wars, which started in 1899 and lasted to about 1902 because there were two of them. And that is the creation of the stay-behind. That was the first time anybody documented in military history the use of a stay-behind unit. And the person that documented it was a reporter named Winston Churchill. So, just to make that clear. Anyway, all right. We're going to close up for today. We'll be back tomorrow. if I can do skinny enough syllabus to get our last 2 chapters into one, we'll close up Indonesia. Otherwise, we will continue Indonesia into Monday, but then hopefully move on from there. Thank you all for being here. I will see you tomorrow at 4 o'clock. And if you come to sit rep tonight, I'll see you in the chat. Talk to you later. What are you doing? You're a silly boy. You're a silly boy. He's not a silly boy. Yes, you are. You're a silly boy. Yes, you're a silly boy. Yeah, I like you. You're a silly boy. You're a silly boy. What's silly boy?